Oh, thanks.
I had called roll for Committee Member Haroff and Committee Member Paulson. Both are present, and I'll call roll for Committee Member Wagstaff.
Yes, present.
And I'll note Committee Member Kunstler is absent.
Thank you. So the second item on the agenda is approval of minutes from the August 11th, 2022 steering committee meeting. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve those?
I'd be happy to make a motion.
Thank you. And a second to Mr. Haroff's motion, the council member.
I'll second it.
Thank you.
Committee Member Haroff?
Yes.
Committee Member Paulson?
Yes, sorry, I'm having connection problems, Allison. I might redial in a minute, but I'm sorry, that's why it's late. I couldn't connect.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
Thank you. And Committee Member Wagstaff?
Yes.
Thank you. So the main item on the agenda, item 3, is the review of the draft sites inventory for the general plan housing element. And Andy, would you like to take over at this point?
I was wondering, Elise, if it might make sense for each of us to have our window open. That way, I'm happy to begin maybe looking through the maps, but maybe if a council member or if a committee member might prefer to see the table, then we could go back and forth. Does that make sense?
Yes, if that works, I will do that. Yes, well, I think it's right here with me. So yeah, that's great. That's a good idea. So I have the table. You'll take the map?
Yeah, I think that'll be good. Oh, how is this? For some reason, when I opened up the packet this time, why don't I have the full packet?
I could put a link in the, or we don't have chat probably, do we?
There were 2 different packets that came. One was a full one and one was just the agenda.
I'll send you one by email so you have it too.
Thank you. I guess that's what there it is. Okay.
Oh, you got it?
Oh, I've got it. Yes.
Okay. Good.
Thank you. I knew I had it earlier. Okay, here we go. So this map might look familiar. It's the one that we brought forward when we were working with the Balancing Act. And so it's separated out in those same neighborhoods that we talked about then. And now as we talk through odds and we get an idea about how things might look, and then we're also on the back end taking a deeper dive, looking more closely at sites that maybe don't make so much sense for this 6th cycle housing element. We know that we have to provide a lot more evidence of the reasonableness in imagining that each site might get developed over the course of this next cycle. We've also heard from some property owners, some who are in favor of considering development on their site, and others who absolutely do not want that. We also know that there's a higher bar for sites that are less than a half acre. I would say it's if we have a site where there's owner interest and it's less than a half acre, then going forward would make a whole lot of sense, because you do have the success for the site where we have what David Masonton refers to as shop houses, the units that are sort of conversionable in your downtown that are such a success, and that was constructed on less than a half acre. So we have the ability to demonstrate. Look, it's the staff here is savvy and capable of bringing something like that forward. But we looked to sites again. So site number 1C, this is a site where there has been owner interest expressed. We know that site 1A, there's already a development proposal in process right now. 1B includes a number of smaller sites that are less likely to develop in this 8-year cycle. We sent out letters to all of these property owners. And so if it's a combination of a small site and we didn't hear back, or if it's a site that was relatively recently developed, then we thought, let's prioritize those sites that we know have a stronger fighting chance of getting developed over time. 1H here is a site where we heard from the property owner. They do not have an interest in developing. 1I is a pretty well-functioning, apparently, medical facility, and even the parking lot seems mostly full on most days. So that seemed like a less likely candidate. 2D, we've kind of known from the beginning, this is the Bonaire Shopping Center. We kind of known from the beginning that wasn't a site that made a lot of sense, large part because there isn't property owner interest. It does make sense for a whole lot of other reasons. Urban design wise, it could just become a little more of a village at that site. But there are a lot of challenges. For instance, there's property ownership, not just long leases, which is something, even if it were just a long lease, HCD would see that and think that that challenge might be too difficult to overcome. We also took out 2A, and Elise, you might want to speak to that one a little bit.
That's the plastic surgery site. So it's in a wonderful location for housing across from Marin Catholic and across from another office building that could also potentially be converted to housing units. However, both of those businesses seem to be doing well, and they're going to be, they didn't express interest, and they're probably unlikely to be wanting to redevelop their sites in 8 years due to the existing commercial uses that are there.
And I guess just to back off of this a little bit and just say this is the easier part of the exercise, to take off sites. So we do have an excess of sites. So we did consider all sites to begin with, and now we're culling to make sure that those sites that we put forward, that we have an easy argument to make when we describe to HCD what our vision is for these sites. 2B is a foregone conclusion. That's not one that's debatable. For 2C, it's a bit of a challenge because we're looking at a site that already has a whole lot of density on the site, but we're beginning to brainstorm about how we might bring this forward along with some other challenges we have related to existing density. 2E, it looks like we're suggesting to take off the site that's along Sir Francis Drake. And Elise, do you want to speak to that a little?
You know, we could leave it on too. There wasn't any owner interest expressed in developing it, so I think it might be more challenging. But we don't necessarily need to remove it. I think again, it's a successful, or it's a currently occupied real estate office, so it may not just be likely to be redeveloped in the next 8 years. And then the adjacent site, I don't know that we have received owner interest, but it sold fairly recently. So I believe it might still be occupied by attorney offices, but there's a possibility because of new purchasers that maybe there would be interest in developing those sites. But overall, the sites are very small compared to the number of units that are possible on the sites are not that great. So it's not a significant part of the inventory one way or the other.
Yeah, the vision would be that it would be consolidated, but we're not hearing that that our suggestion that it be on this list carry much weight as far as the owner interest. So it's a little more challenging. 2F, this site could easily be, or could conceivably be adaptively reused as housing, and not many office buildings can tout that. So that's one option. It could otherwise be redeveloped. 2G, it looks like we are taking this one off, and this is a city-owned site that is operated by the rowing club. Elise, if you wanted to speak to that anymore.
That one, we did receive comments of concern from people. I think it would also delay the housing element if we were to propose changing the use of that site, just because of the controversy from the public. So I wouldn't rule it out, and because it's a city-owned site, it could be proposed at any time, even if it's not on the inventory. But I think it might just slow the process down if we were to include it on the inventory.
Then we have the Larkspur landing sites, all of which, most of which we're suggesting remain, but except for ferry terminal.
The ferry terminal lot was never actually on as I was making the map. So that parking lot, I think, has a lot of potential for housing. Obviously, we'd have to work out issues of flooding and sea level rise, and there is some tanks of fuel that are there. But the district hasn't returned any of my requests to talk to them about it, and they do have plans to build a parking structure at the site. So and it requires rezoning, and so it's not maybe something that would happen in the next 8 years. There's the adjacent site 3C that was on there is where the electric bike shop is. And so I don't know, we removed it. I don't know that we need to, but I also don't know how much potential it has for redevelopment in this cycle, because the electric bicycle shop and the other spaces appear to be rented right now.
It's also a small site, and we didn't hear back about property owner interest.
I just wanted to note on the prior one, these are our highest for the Larkspur Landing. These sites carry the most units of all, well, with the exception of the county site further down, the majority of the sites in the housing element. And one of the good reasons is because it's right near transit. So train and ferry and bus transit. Also because 3E is a vacant lot, which a vacant lot is going to be the easiest to develop. And then we have owner interest in developing 200 units of housing at 3A, which is important too. So that would be tucked at the back of the site over a parking lot adjacent to the hillside area. So I think Larkspur Landing is just the most promising area to develop because we believe it could accommodate higher densities in terms of larger buildings. So the majority of these were left in because of they're just promising for housing.
More units and greater access to resources and less likely to impact neighborhoods too.
And larger projects bring in a lot more affordable housing, and our 979 number is pretty much 50% affordable housing. So the more larger market rate unit projects, the more affordable housing projects are just required by city rules to be built.
And here we've got our central Larkspur area. So it looks like 4D has been taken off, and that's the siting for the future library and community center, right, Elise?
That's correct.
And so that's mainly the reason why it's taken off, because there's other
people. There was a lot of objections to including that site in the comments, and I think again it would slow the process down to have that discussion. And it sounds like there has been talk about housing before that didn't proceed.
And for 4C and 4B, the vision is likely a consolidation, even though that might be difficult, right? But we can do things to maybe incentivize that or encourage it through our programs.
Right, and these sites have been on the last two housing elements and haven't been developed. So the city is required to allow housing by right at these sites if we include them again too. And then part of our recommendations with the housing element is to increase density on the sites. They're allowed 21 units an acre now, and to go to 35 as more incentive to have housing developed on the site. So that's what's been proposed on the draft inventory map.
Yeah. And we've taken out almost all of downtown for multiple reasons. And we've got 5A remaining, and we likely have some property owner interest there. We also have 2 sites here in the heart of downtown. Did you want to mention anything about those?
Yeah, I was going to see if I could, and addresses may not be that meaningful, but one of the dentist office that's immediately adjacent to the fire station, and then the site at the corner could have housing above it, and I believe someone's come in to inquire about that. So those are not large sites for the housing element. They wouldn't produce a significant number of units, even at 35 units an acre. because the sites are so small, but they do have owner interest.
And that's a good point about 5A also. There's already a number of units that are there that are naturally occurring affordable units, some basically studio apartments. So getting above what it, as a net number, what already exists there is kind of difficult unless we consider how important it is on smaller sites to enable that higher density. Then we have the cost plus site. For now, we are including that. We do have property owner interest for that one. And the San Quentin site, which would involve annexation, but that's a very high likelihood.
And then just want everyone to be aware that if we did not annex it, then the city does need to find a location for an extra 250 affordable housing units, which would mean finding, probably another, I don't want to say 1,000, but it could be over 1,000 market rate units to get that ratio of affordable to market rate. So it would be very challenging if we didn't have this site developed within the city during this housing element period.
So Elise and Andy, just a quick question. I mean, I think that was in the IIJ today. The Oak Hill site. There was the county has formed a JPA. And it looks like they're using their education folks, and I forget the name of the Mill Valley based developer or whatever. Any indication of likelihood, or I read that as I was surprised we weren't mentioned anywhere in there. I mean, what are the chances that that can be annexed, or do we need to get in early on this development process?
I haven't been here long enough to know what the conversations were before I was here. It's my understanding that there's interest in annexation because all of the services would be much more convenient coming from the city of Larkspur in terms of police and fire, because we'd be closer to response. So I think it makes sense for us to annex instead of having the sheriff and county fire department respond to that site. And we're willing to consider annexation. And so my hope is that it's something that will happen, but I don't really know what the likelihood is.
Okay. And Andy, I'm not clear. Is this in our housing element map? I think it is, right?
It's not currently, just mostly as a consequence of the tool that we're working with through ABAG stays clean on existing city boundaries.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. So it would be a bonus, and we haven't counted it in any of our calculations.
We've counted it in our calculations because it really makes a difference in our calculations. It's a quarter of the units that we need. So and it's 100% affordable housing. So it's a really important site to have developed for our housing elements. And again, if we had to take it out, we'd be putting all those other sites back in and having a really hard time justifying where we're going to get that much affordable housing, because the other sites, for all the reasons we've said, are not likely to develop in the next 8 years. So it could mean having to significantly upzone the vacant lots and the other larger lots in the city.
Got it. One last thing, I might need. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say I might need to disconnect here for a minute. I'll reconnect in about 60 seconds because I've got some problems here at home with the router.
Okay. This is Kevin. I was rudely interrupting Gabe. Can everybody hear me? Because I'm on my telephone.
Yes.
Okay, good. And I've got my screen on too, so I can see everything. The annexation issue is an exciting prospect. And I've been involved in some discussions at an earlier stage on that, but I have no idea where things stand. I think it would be helpful for this group to get an update from Dan, who should know more than any of us would know about where those conversations are at this point. I mean, we're kind of working in the dark in what could be one of the more significant properties for our housing element.
Thank you for that.
People agree.
Yeah, so and I say that we are working, I'm working with our housing element consultant and city attorney to try to incorporate this project into our draft general plan environmental impact report so that we're prepared to have the zoning in place so that annexation could take place. So it's we're working
things we got to zone it.
Well, we're working towards it, but I think we need to know that the state would request annexation. I believe would be.
Well, that's the $1 million question. Where is the state on that?
Okay. Yeah, I think an update from Dan would be good if we have one from him.
I don't see that why the state would have any interest in doing anything other than have us annex this property. We'll be good stewards of it. It makes sense from a housing perspective, and they don't have to deal with it anymore.
Does the unincorporated Marin have RENA numbers?
They have a lot of units in their housing element, but I'm sure they're also very interested in keeping this in their housing element. But they did identify a lot of sites, so I think it's not critical to their housing element.
Yeah,
but they did identify this site as a candidate site for their purposes.
Yes.
And what we know though is also even if at worst case if HCD were to give them credit through their housing element, what matters is once it gets constructed, whose jurisdiction is it in? So if it were to be counted in their housing element and then annexation happens and then it gets constructed, it would then count towards your RENA in your annual progress report. So the credit will be given to you.
Yeah, and it's just a matter of how, I mean, it's not the county's property, but, you know, I'm sure it's appealing to them if they think they can use it for their own housing element. If we annexed it, we'd have full control over the property. And again, I don't see why the state wouldn't want to do that.
So at least from
observation, while Gabe is still waiting to get back on.
And I would say too, because it's a affordable housing site, there may not be property tax revenue like there would be for a market rate. I'm just putting that out because there's financial implications of doing it that would be something the council would consider. And then also, I believe even the building permit may go through the state. So it's not something that the city would be monitoring and during construction, but that's just based on what I was reading in the staff report at the county level today. So there's more for the council to consider before making a decision about it.
I mean, I would go to the state even if we annexed it.
Pardon me?
If we annexed it, the state would still have to get the building permit?
Well, I believe from the materials I saw that they're actually applying to the state for the building permit, like a school would apply to the state for a building permit.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the units are specifically for teachers. So it's JPA that really ties in the county's education department. And I think 100 plus are for teachers and then another 30 or 40 for, supporting staff at schools, whatever that means, administrators or, maybe building facilities. So yeah, but I totally agree. This would be a good one to ask Dan, and I'm curious to reach out to the county myself, just maybe at some point to know what or to see what it was presented at the Board of Supervisors, right? Today was the meeting, or
today Tuesday.
Yeah, Tuesday, yeah,
yesterday.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I don't think we've had any word. I mean, unless Dan knows something.
Well, this is a conversation we can
they're doing they're doing the environmental review for the project, so that's moving along. It hasn't been released yet. It'll probably come out about the same time that our environmental review comes out for the draft general plan. So the project's continuing to proceed, but it'll be some time before there's any action on the environmental review document too.
Sure.
I'm happy to go back to any map that folks might like to ask more questions about or deliberate or discuss.
And there are members of the public here if you wanted to take comments on anything from the public before you discuss.
Right. I guess this is because we got, well, is this considered to be an ad hoc committee?
I mean, it's just to inform your decision if someone's here to support or oppose a project. It'd be good for us to know.
And that's fine. If there's anybody out there, we're happy to do it. I just didn't know whether that was the status. Could I just go back to the Bridge District ferry building property?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear very well.
Is that the Golden Gate Transit or the sewer agency?
Oh,
no, not the sewer agency. The parking lot for the ferry terminal. That's Bridge District property, correct?
Correct.
And I've seen various conceptual plans for that property, some of which might in fact lend themselves to housing use. I mean, it's not just they're not contemplating just a parking structure. They're contemplating at a minimum a parking structure with exterior parking and commercial uses. And it'll be a pretty, if it gets built, it'll be a pretty sizable structure. If that's the priority one that they want to do, and I think it is. So I don't think we should rule out that property as an opportunity for us in housing. There might be a lot of people who would like to live there because they could just walk out their front door and be at the ferry.
It'd be very convenient and also supporting the market and close to the other shopping center in Bon Air and transit. Again, it supports the idea of, and I pointed this out at the last meeting, this is one of the areas of the city that has the lowest vehicle miles traveled, probably because it's right next to the ferry, and there might be people there that are just significantly reducing their trips by taking the ferry to work from here.
Yeah, one of the biggest problems with that property are the people across the water, because that's not a housing problem. There will be objections to a large structure that's lit up at night.
Does anyone else have thoughts on including it? I don't have any concerns with including it. I mean, to me, it makes a lot of sense.
I think it should be included.
I don't know I don't know if there's a reason it shouldn't be included unless we've had communications with Bridge District and they've told us they're not interested in that. But I don't think that's occurred.
It seems like the potential for something that has both commercial and housing makes sense for any developer of that piece of property. And you will have parking. So
it would also be a lot easier to have a partnership with a nonprofit to develop affordable housing because it is a public agency. I think it would seem, and there's also areas of the site in the, I guess you'd say there's a west corner that really isn't even part of the main parking lot right now. That just seems like another potential area where even 50 units might be able to be built if not more.
It's not all paved there. There's other, it's a big piece of property. And it would be, I think, very attractive place to live because it's a very
and from the street side could even make it so that people aren't viewing a gigantic parking structure if it was designed so that the residences are camouflaging the parking structure behind it.
Exactly. I mean, people want to live on Sir Francis Strait, but that to be dealt with through architectural design.
It seems to me that it's more likely to be able to convince somebody that housing is a good option there than necessarily annex the property, the other piece of property that we're talking about. I mean, the county's also
much more simple.
Yeah. I worry about the whole annexation idea, particularly when you're counting 220 units or 250 units of the amount we need to come up with.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think annexation per se is something that can't be done. You know, I think the challenge with that property is we've already got multiple parties that have interests that would have to be accommodated, and that I think would be the biggest challenge to go forward with annexation.
If I may, there is a higher bar from HCD's perspective when we're talking about a state agency, sort of similar to schools, so that I wholly support the idea of including this in our preliminary draft with HCD. I just would want to give a heads up that there may be a little pushback asking for higher
densities.
Certainty. Yeah, even just a letter.
Oh.
And Elise, I know you've been attempting this. I just, and this could be the flag that gets their attention. Well, okay, you're on our list now. You're part of our housing element now. So,
yeah. So what do you want to do?
Yeah.
Okay. And that was a little bit of a detour there. So if you want to go back to your presentation, that'd be great.
Oh, I think we're complete with the presentation. This is the part where we'll discuss, and we can go back and forth with the tables as well.
Since we have this page open, this is another area where we're proposing higher densities. So currently 21 units an acre is allowed, which would accommodate the numbers that are proposed in the inventory if the applicants took advantage of the density bonus law, but the state doesn't necessarily believe that everyone's gonna, I guess, we can't just use that as a guarantee of number of units. So having a higher density is just more assurance to the state that the numbers that we're putting in the report are gonna be constructed. So 35 units an acre is what we're proposing for these sites here. And I think it was I can't remember if we put 3D as 21 an acre, but 35 an acre, from a planner perspective, I think is reasonable for these sites. The key is going to be having it come forward with those objective design standards. So there's some parameters on what it would look like, and understanding that they're going to be asking for exceptions, and knowing what taller buildings would look like.
Is 3B where the theater is?
Right.
Yeah. So there's this, and then next to it is the parking area?
Correct.
You probably can't see my arrow.
And then there's 3 office buildings and
right.
Additional parking. And even the property owners have been attending these meetings because they are definitely interested in adding housing to the site.
This is a good example of the little bit of a challenge we have about densities, whether we go minimum or maximum. But that might be a conversation for another day. But as you can imagine, though, if we have this 3D where it's one portion of a much larger site, it doesn't make sense to maybe go minimum because it's such a small portion of the lot. And then we have the opposite, sort of a dichotomous situation here, where at 3A, you're squeezing in some units back behind the buildings that are existing and will remain. So whether you say minimum or maximum can make a difference for the number of units that would get developed there and the feasibility. And so
the lower number, with the lower density of 21 units an acre, it's still possible to put a couple hundred units on the site, but they'd all have to be merged together. Whereas with the higher density, maybe they only merge a couple of those lots together. Since they're all under common ownership, it may not be that challenging, but it's just one of the issues that we're considering.
Yeah.
And of course, the ferry site is another good example where if we were to say that there should be a minimum density when housing is constructed, it's such a large site that would
actually be minimum densities could be
a
something
barrier.
that it's a barrier to development because someone may not want to develop a minimum number for that large site, or even considering that Marin Mart site, Marin Country Mart, that would be a significant number of units if it had to be the entire site. But they could carve a smaller lot out too.
There seem to be an awful lot of opportunities with the ferry building parking lot.
Does anyone else have questions?
Just real quick, Elise, I offline, I was checking in with you about the North Magnolia portions that College of Marin might own, and I know that was the 11th hour. Is that anything we should talk about?
Yeah, that's a good point. So we didn't have it on the map, and there's the count. Unfortunately, it's not showing on the parcel lines aren't really showing on this map, but the College of Marin owns all of that field area, all of the land that is that building number 1144 and the parking lot in front of it, that building there, that white building that was just being hovered over. All those big lots are College of Marin property within our city jurisdiction. And so there is a lot of promise for structures there on like previously disturbed land, either land that's being used as parking lots, or if they were going to change the use of those buildings there. So I think it's promising. And I guess one of the reasons why we didn't include it was because we don't need to. If the city or the school district was to come in and build, they would be maybe exempt from a lot of the city's zoning regulations anyway. I think that was the only reason I was thinking that it wasn't too critical to have them in, but they would be promising sites and they could be added. There's environmental impacts with development there that we wouldn't want to slow down the whole housing element to include it.
It's also a higher bar, like for any school site to be included, there really needs to be a very strong letter of intention to build within that 8-year cycle, and that can be a difficult thing to
and for the other
conclusion.
school districts, they have areas too that could be developed into housing, but they don't have. They're working on their master plans, and so if something was put in their master plan, then it would seem more feasible for us to rely on that for development of housing. So maybe in the next cycle, if Larkspur School District or Tamalpais was to propose housing in their master plan, that it would be more realistic for us to include it in the housing element. And then the housing element could always be amended to include it through that process too. So
we can also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, we can also include it as a program to join some of their master plan conversations, or to at least make sure that they're aware of the welcomeness that the city would have, the welcoming for housing to be built at this site and incorporated in the master plan.
Yeah.
So at this time, they couldn't say that they, at least for the Larkspur School District, they could not say that they were interested or not interested because they have to go through that planning process too.
Yeah, but I think the point is if we communicate our interest to them without requiring a commitment per se, that could set the stage for some productive discussions going forward in the future.
And then the College of Marin site too is promising if they were to work with the Masons. Is that, I hope I'm not.
The Masonic Lodge.
Masonic Lodge, right? Because the building we're looking at it in the screen, there's a parking lot behind it, and there's just more room. If they were to work together, they'd be able to make that potentially more than 10 units. I think we're proposing it for 10 units of affordable housing, but it would be much more feasible if they had more room to work with.
Yeah, Elise, should we try to meet, or is it? Do you feel it's too late in the
I think
process?
no, I don't think it's too late at all. It'd be a good idea to meet.
Because I have no idea. I mean, I met with the College of Marin, and I got the feeling that they would really like to to talk about it, and where it goes, I have no idea. But it seems like we could do a 30-minute meeting or something like that, and see if it's relevant to this conversation.
That'd be great.
Would it count if they built sort of advanced student housing in the sense that they're individual, maybe they're just studio units with a with a kitchen and a bathroom, and they can have students come from other places. In theory, would it count for our numbers? Would those kinds of units count?
What we know for certain is that dorms don't count.
Right.
But when you go to the design of individual units, that's a little bit of a gray area. The other piece that we know is that student housing was not anticipated as part of the RENA analysis. So that might be a factor in whether or not student housing would then count as, in my mind, it should count, because even being able to house the students would take pressure off and competition off of other units that might be available within the community.
Yeah, or teachers and
faculty, right?
Yeah, all the people that are needed to run a college.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be limited to student housing. I mean, it could be, a mixed.
So Andy,
group of people.
Faculty and staff housing would count towards RENA, but student housing and dormitories would not.
I know that dormitories would not. When you have student housing that are actual units, that's a little bit of a gray area. I'd have to do a little more research. I believe that they should count. I believe that they would count. I just have to make sure.
I think it's that issue of having the housing with no kitchens is like even group homes.
Right.
If they don't have individual kitchens, we can't count right now.
No, that's not what's being suggested.
Right.
And that is dormitory.
Sort of ADU level housing.
Right.
Or micro units.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what my daughter almost has down at Santa Clara, and they can be very, very, very nice. And especially if they're mixed in with other populations, that might make it more saleable.
Wonderful.
So let's give it a go.
Yeah, and we'd love feedback on how we might format a program also for supporting it.
Yeah,
for the seventh cycle as well.
I really like that idea, because it's kind of preliminary, but it shows intent and an opportunity for the discussion.
And we can do both. Okay.
Are there any people in the audience, can you tell, that want to talk? Or
there are people in the audience. Please raise your hand if you'd like to make a comment, and we could call on you. I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Okay. Well, I thought this was a very constructive conversation. You guys have done a lot of good work. And I know sometimes when you think a property may be good for our needs and the owner says no, that can be frustrating. But that's, I think, just part of the process.
And I appreciate that there's a buffer of units, because I do think as some of these sites, if they're not developed, or if someone comes in with a smaller project, that there's still some, we don't have to go and revise the whole housing element. So with the exception of the San Quentin site, which would definitely require some type of change to the housing element. But the other, it makes me feel comfortable to have the other buffers. There is someone in the audience now that's raising their hand. Paul Sternberger, I'm going to allow you to speak.
I guess I should just say hi because I've never attended one of these before. And I have the tiny micro property next to the movie theater that's kind of towards the entrance of Larkspur. And I'm open to just starting to talk to a developer and just open to, being part of the solution if possible down the road, and open to just nothing immediately married to any particular idea yet. But I'm the one, I already have 4 studios on one property and 1 small house on the other. So I don't know how it all fit in. It's much smaller than the other sites that you've been talking about in Larkspur Landing. It's not going to solve your housing needs unless you let me build 20 stories. So I just wanted to say hello, and it was nice to be able to hear what's happening.
Thank you very much for that. Those are helpful suggestions, and
well, thank you.
We should take them into account.
This also brings up the idea of what might be possible with SB 10. So for 5A, which I believe is the site that this caller was mentioning, even combined, this is, I think, just shy of a ½ acre. And when you're using almost any density number, it's hard to make it pencil. But the idea that 10 units might be allowed at this location it is something that could be negotiated. SB 10 is an optional legislation, so that it's not like SB 9 where it's mandated it must be allowed for all single family. This is something where if you have a single family zoned lot, you can propose to a city that they consider the idea that up to 10 units might be permitted for a site, and there's a streamlining opportunity. It's CEQA exempt, I believe. So just food for thought.
Yeah, I think those are all everything you just said. I think is true.
We could include in our draft, excuse me. Oh, so when we get to the programs and policies, there could be something that makes it clear to HCD that the city is open to hearing these kinds of proposals and open to negotiating for property owners to take advantage of this opportunity.
Right. Right. So thank you, Paul, for bringing it to our attention.
Andy, is the Lucky Supermarket parking lot area and the Nazari property, is that on a different page? That's all inclusive in that, right? Yeah.
Right. 4C is the Lucky
right.
site, and then 4B is the Nazari property.
Yeah. Okay.
But I understand why you're asking about it, because I was asked to make a very clear distinction between 4 and 5, but in fact they're right across the street from each other.
Right. It just looks strange.
It's right here. Yes, it's on post. So this is 557 and 559.
Right.
It's the location.
And just one more question. Where does the historic, the question with the Nazari property is there are buildings on there that were part of the old railroad. What's the obligation to retain, quote, historic buildings?
Well, it is protected under the city's historic preservation ordinance, that the train station. So I think there is an obligation to protect it or incorporate it into a plan. The specific plan, Central Larkspur specific plan, does have some protections, and I think well, it would be a good idea to try to make some of the standards in those specific plans objective, so that if I'm not sure that it's a good question, is how if a project complies with is coming in with affordable housing and is not subject to typical review, if somehow having that historic building on the site precludes it from qualifying for not having like only application of objective standards. But I'll find out more about how that works. We would definitely want to list that as a constraint to the development of this site, because I think it is kind of in the center of that triangle parcel. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind with all of these sites in the screen here is just the potential for accidental discovery of Native American resources too. So these have their own challenges, in addition to having to be having consolidation issues and multiple ownership. So these are challenging sites. If these were the only ones in the housing element, I think we would have a hard time meeting our numbers potentially. But if there's some question about the units here, I think, I guess they're not critical to our numbers if it doesn't get developed in the next 8 years.
I'm pretty familiar with that particular property, because we tried to propose storefronts and underground parking and apartments above, and it got completely squashed because you've got some old buildings back behind. The train station itself you could preserve, but some of the other ones, it really is the tail wagging the dog. And I'm curious to know what this allows people to do.
I'll find out more about that, because we could outline that in our housing element too, so that it's if it's a constraint, it's identified.
Yeah.
And this area is within the scope of the CLASP, correct?
Right.
And every time somebody says something about development within that area, it causes controversy.
Right. So we will have to look at that, because if we are changing the zoning to allow more density, it's going to potentially conflict with some of those plans too. And then also the objective standards for this area, they probably aren't in conflict with those plans, but the plans are definitely discretionary and have a lot of discretionary provisions. So trying to make them consistent would be good.
Yeah, and I think part of the objection is if we encourage development within part of the CLASP, even if we're doing a good job with it, it opens up the prospect of doing development in other parts of the CLASP, and that probably would never be allowed.
Yes.
Which is why I'm sure one of the reasons why you guys stayed away from the downtown area.
Yeah, and those sites, the other section of downtown, which is a historic district, so it has that challenge, but they're also very small sites. So we're looking at 1 or 2 units. If you go to 35 units an acre, you're still looking at maybe less than 4 units. So they're already developed, and they just aren't promising for a lot of housing. Like, it would be great. There's a lot of opportunity for people to add 1 unit or 2 units here or there, but it would be difficult to rely on it, particularly since we've had, I think, 4 units of housing built there over the last cycle.
Yeah, I mean, Gerardi put a couple of very nice apartments up there above one of his properties.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not precluding development of housing there. It's just not something we're anticipating for the next 8 years cycle.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Yeah. Yes. And again, good work. I think actually in many respects from our last meeting, you know, you probably heard some sense of frustration from me about what was being contemplated. I think part of that frustration was just not appreciating the dynamics of property owner conversations. And you made it clear that you know what you're doing in that context, and I appreciate that.
What I'd like to do too is now that we have a little more concrete sites, to start having more specific outreach with people in these areas so that they are aware that the sites have been identified, because there hasn't been a lot of direct communication with neighbors, and just so we get those comments now while the draft is being drafted. I think that would be important to do, and then we're not surprised when the draft comes out.
Elise, speaking of outreach, I hope this isn't off topic, but you know, you were at Piper with the table, and I think you've been doing a bit of outreach. You know, any sort of high level takeaways?
So I had the same map, essentially the same sites that you just looked at, and didn't receive negative comments. Overall, I think people were I didn't receive anyone with concerns about those sites. I'm trying to think of if there were any that were a problem, and I can't think of any. Other than, you know, I think Marin Rowing Company comes up often as someplace where people don't want to see housing. The Rose Garden site is another one that people have mentioned they don't want to see housing. But then other people were in support of housing at the Rose Garden site. So
yeah.
And then the exercise, we didn't go over, and I didn't provide information on the mapping exercise. I know I've gone over that with Andy in the past, and that was very similar to what we're proposing now too. So there was a lot of concern about housing downtown, and a lot of more support for housing in the Larkspur Landing area. So, and then concerns about housing in North Magnolia. So it's I think the inventory that we presented tonight is reflective of the comments that we received from the people that responded to that poll too.
Are you still looking for input to the you know, the website, or is that, you know, a little bit late in the game?
We'll be continuing to use the website through our draft housing review process, and also through whatever CEQA review we end up going forward with. So yes, we warmly receive comments if you have
yeah
them.
I think what we've closed the survey that we had, and then I think, Andy, it'll take a different form with this new inventory and the draft housing element. That's so right. It's probably time to take off some of the other exercises for now, and then encourage people to look at the next stage.
Yes.
Let's see, is there anything else on the agenda? I think public open time for items that are not on the agenda. If there's anyone in the audience that has a comment on something that wasn't on the agenda, they could speak now. I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. Sounds like that. Time for a motion to adjourn.
Thank you. All right.
Okay.
Second.
Everybody fine with that?
Yeah, I'll second that.
Good. But well, as I always like to say when I have the opportunity, by consensus, we are adjourned.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.